In a low building at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware sits the only laboratory in the United States military built to pull identity out of human bone. It is the place they bring the unaccounted for, the fragments recovered from crash sites and old battlefields, the remains that have no name attached. A few hundred miles south, in Charlestown, West Virginia, there is a quiet family cemetery called Harewood, and in its ground lay a row of graves that no marker could explain, bones broken and scattered and nearly 2 centuries old. Between those two places there was a single tube of blood drawn from one living man, and a machine capable of reading roughly 95,000 points across a human genome. And there was a genealogical database in Houston, Texas, holding the paternal signatures of millions of people who had spilled into a vial and asked the same question everyone eventually asks: who was I before me? Here is the part that should stop you. For more than 200 years, the most painted, most quoted, most carved and cast and stamped man in American history had no genetic identity that anyone could actually read. We knew his face better than we know our neighbors. We did not know his DNA at all. And when the people at that military laboratory finally went looking, what came back was not what they went in expecting. The kinship they measured came back closer than they had predicted, close enough that the researchers had to recheck their own work. Something in the ground had kept a record no monument ever could. This quietly redraws a line most of us never think about, the line between the famous dead and the forgotten dead, and it turns out that line is thinner than anyone assumed. Now, let's talk about what the bones actually gave up. The spine of this whole story is a single study, published in 2024 in the journal iScience, and it did not come out of a university history department. It came out of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System's DNA Identification Laboratory, the Department of Defense's only human remains DNA lab. The first author was a scientist named Courtney Cavagnino. The senior author was Charla Marshall, Deputy Director of Department of Defense DNA Operations. These are not genealogists chasing a celebrity ancestor. These are the people whose day job is confirming the identities of the dead when almost nothing usable is left. What they set out to do at Harewood sounds simple and was not. There were unmarked, fragmentary remains in that cemetery, believed to belong to members of the Washington family, and the team wanted to confirm exactly who they were by comparing the degraded bone against the clean, living DNA of a descendant. The reason this was ambitious is that the whole point was the difficulty. They were not just trying to name 3 sets of old bones. They were stress testing a set of new methods on remains bad enough to break older techniques, so that those methods could then be trusted on even harder cases. To do any of it, they needed to read a paternal signature, the piece of the genome that passes down the male line almost unchanged, called the Y-chromosome haplogroup. Think of it for now as a kind of surname written into the chromosome itself, one that never changes its spelling as it moves from father to son to grandson. They would need that signature badly. But before they could read anyone at all, they hit a problem no amount of technology could solve on its own. The first surprise in this story was not something in the data, it was the absence of it. George Washington, the father of the country, was, in the most literal genetic sense, a blank. He and Martha had no children together. There was no direct biological line running down from the man himself, no son, no grandson, no unbroken chain of descendants carrying his signature forward into a living person who could simply spit in a tube. The most exhaustively documented American who ever lived had left no readable copy of his own genome anywhere on Earth. Every portrait survived. The one thing that makes each of us physically unique had not. This is the strange emptiness at the center of the whole endeavor. We have his teeth, his letters, his account books, the exact dimensions of his shoes. We did not have him. And so the team could not read Washington by finding Washington. There was no Washington to find. If they wanted his signature, they were going to have to go looking for him sideways, through the people around the gap he left. The place that solution came from is the second thing that should surprise you, because the people who ultimately reconstructed a president were not looking for a president at all. They were looking for soldiers. The Armed Forces Medical Examiner Systems Laboratory exists to support the identification of service members lost in past conflicts, an effort that reaches all the way back to World War II, working alongside the agency responsible for accounting for the nation's missing war dead. Their casework is the hardest kind of DNA there is, remains that have spent decades or longer in soil, in seawater, in wreckage, degraded far past the point where ordinary testing works. That is precisely why the Washington family graves mattered to them. To get better at reading the ruined DNA of the forgotten, they needed a real test, remains old enough and damaged enough to be genuinely hard, but attached to a family documented enough that a correct answer could be checked. The unmarked bones at Harewood, dating to the mid-1800s, were exactly that test. A famous family and a nameless problem sitting in the same ground, which brought them straight to the question at the heart of the science. How do you rebuild a man from fragments? Here is where the mechanism comes into focus, and where the difficulty finally has a name. Old bone does not yield a clean genome. It yields shatter, DNA broken into short pieces, chemically damaged, mixed with the DNA of bacteria and of everyone who ever handled the remains. Reading kinship out of that mess is the entire problem. So the team used more than one tool at once. They read the Y chromosome to trace the paternal line. They read mitochondrial DNA, which passes down the maternal line to trace the mothers. And then they applied a newer method built for exactly this kind of ruin, analyzing next-generation sequencing data across about 95,000 nuclear markers, single points of variation, to infer how closely related people were even across the gulf of generations and decay. With those methods stacked together, they did something remarkable. They resolved which specific male among the remains was the direct ancestor of the living descendant, and the relationships they measured came back closer than they had first assumed. But that raised an obvious objection, and a good one. The remains they were working with were not Washington himself. They were his grandnephews, Samuel Walter Washington and George Steptoe Washington Jr., and their mother, Lucy Payne Washington. Grandnephews are indirect relations. They are not a straight biological line down from the man. So how could reading them tell you anything at all about George? Think of it like this. You cannot sample a mountain spring directly if the spring itself has run dry. But if several streams downstream all carry the exact same mineral signature in their water, you do not need the spring. You know what fed them. The grandnephews and the living descendant and George Washington himself were all direct paternal descendants of the same man, Augustine Washington, George's father. Down that male line, the Y chromosome signature is the same in every branch, unchanged, identical. So the streams could tell you about the source. The DNA had kept the record of it, and once that line held, they could finally read the one signature no one had ever seen. The biggest reveal in this whole story is not a scandal, it is a number. For the first time in history, the researchers inferred George Washington's own Y chromosome haplogroup, the paternal signature that had been unreadable for 2 centuries. They designated it RBY32422, and it turned out to be quite rare in the reference database, uncommon enough that it stands out. That alone would have been the finish line, but the work did not stop there. Follow-up analysis in 2026, using high-coverage paternal line testing, pushed the signature deeper down its own branch and placed the presidential Washington lineage within a much older group known as RU-152, a lineage roughly 4,500 years old. And there, at that ancient depth, the Washington paternal line meets another. It shares that deep root with Abraham Lincoln. Two of the most mythologized men in American history, the founder and the preserver, trace their male lines back to the same branch of the human family planted on the continent of Europe more than 4,000 years before either man was born. Which raises a stranger question than any scandal would have. If the science could still find this, if something this fundamental about Washington was genuinely unknown until a military lab went and recovered it, then why did we ever believe there was nothing left to find? Why did the most documented man in America feel finished, closed, fully known?
So if the record was never actually complete, where did the feeling of completeness come from? It did not come from evidence. It was built deliberately by people with a reason to build it. Washington died in 1799, and almost immediately the myth-making began. Within a year, a traveling bookseller and preacher named Mason Locke Weems published a biography of Washington that would go through edition after edition and shape how generations of Americans pictured him. It is the book that gave us the cherry tree, the little boy who could not tell a lie, the hatchet, the tender confession. None of it happened. Weems invented the cherry tree story and inserted it into a later edition precisely because the public wanted a Washington who was not just a general, but a moral fable, a man carved from virtue rather than born from a family. And that is the machinery that made the gaps invisible. As the marble went up, as the monuments rose, and the portraits multiplied, and the myth hardened into something you could stamp on a coin, Washington stopped being a person with unknown corners and became a finished symbol, complete by definition. A symbol does not have missing data. A monument does not have an unread genome. The very completeness we inherited was a product of storytelling and stagecraft, of a young country that needed a flawless founder more than it needed an accurate one. The myth kept no record of the actual man. It replaced him, but the bones in the ground and the signature written down the male line had kept the record all along, waiting for someone to finally read it. Which brings us to the part of the story that has almost nothing to do with a president at all.
Because the method that finally read George Washington was never built for George Washington. It was built for the nameless. Every technique the team validated at Harewood, the stacked reading of degraded DNA, the kinship inference across ruined and fragmentary bone, exists to serve one mission above all others, the identification of service members who have lain unaccounted for since the Second World War and the wars after it. The whole reason a president's paternal line got reconstructed at all is that his old, damaged family remains made a good enough proving ground to sharpen a tool meant for soldiers with no headstones. The same triangulation that gave Washington his signature is spent, day after day, giving anonymous remains back their names and giving living families back the dead they lost. And there is one more turn, the one that includes you. That ancient branch, RU-152, the 4,500-year-old lineage the Washington line belongs to, is not rare at all at its root. It is one of the common paternal lineages of Western and Central Europe, carried today by many millions of ordinary living men who will never have a monument, never have a portrait, never have a myth. The presidential lineage, at the depth where it becomes interesting, is a human one. There has never been a genetic aristocracy. There has never been a bloodline that reads, under the sequencer, as anything more than human. There has never been a signature in the chromosome that says founder or great man or father of a country. There's only the same alphabet, written down every male line that has ever existed, in a president and in a stranger, in exactly the same ink. So state it plainly. The DNA did not expose a hidden identity. It did not reveal a secret ancestry or a buried scandal or a truth that overturns who Washington was. What it revealed was quieter and stranger than any of that. It revealed that even the single most documented man in the history of the nation had a fundamental part of himself go completely unread for 2 centuries, until the people whose calling is the forgotten dead reached down and reconstructed it out of broken bone. And here the honesty has to hold, because this is where a story like this can overreach, and it will not. An inferred haplogroup is a probability drawn from careful comparison, not a birth certificate signed by the man. Ancient and degraded DNA is fragmentary by nature, and every reading of it carries uncertainty that responsible scientists state out loud. This kind of work gets breathless coverage, headlines that promise revelations the data never contained, and none of what was actually found rewrites a single fact about who Washington was as a person, what he did, or how history should weigh him. The finding is smaller than a myth and somehow larger. Holding that line, refusing to inflate it, is the whole point. The truth here does not need to be exaggerated to be astonishing. So go back to where we started. Go back to the blank, the man with no readable genome. Go back to the unmarked graves at Harewood with no stones to name them. Go back to the marble monument that told us, for 200 years, that there was nothing left to learn. And watch all 3 of those images dissolve into the same simple fact. The record we treat as finished is mostly still in the ground. The completeness was always a story we told ourselves, and the science that reached just once, all the way up to touch a president, is spent, overwhelmingly and by design, on people whose names we lost and are still trying to recover. Which leaves a question worth carrying out of here, and it is not one anyone can answer for you. If the same method, the same patient reading of broken bone, can restore the signature of a founder and the name of an unknown soldier, and if under that reading the 2 of them look like exactly what they are, 2 men, equally human, all the way down, then what do we owe the ones still waiting in the ground without names? The lab at Dover will keep working. The record will keep coming up out of the dark, one fragment at a time. What we decide it means and who we decide is worth the reaching has never been written in the DNA. That part was always ours.